Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And joining me once again on the channel is James M. Scott, this time to talk about 3 US submarines in the war against Japan, but also kind of a wider discussion about doctrine and tactics and the approach to undersea water. James's book, The War Below, is as good as his other books, and links to purchasing it on the description below. So I'm going to bring James in now. Good afternoon, James. How are you today?
Hey, it's great to be back with you. I'm great. Thank you.
So we were just chatting before going live there. The submarines is a fascinating subject. I can't believe it's taken through 2.5 years to get round to discussing as a separate subject. And one of the recurring themes that we've had on this channel is how slowly the Allies are to get their mind around, if you like, new types of warfare, and strategic bombing takes a long time to, no pun intended, get off the ground. And the British struggle with how to use artillery, and the British struggle, and everyone struggles with how to use so-called special forces. But submarine warfare, in terms of the American point of view, that was something you were pretty much getting sorted out in the interwar period. So let's start with that sort of transition from what had been happening at the end of the First World War, and how the US Navy and the kind of the bigwigs are looking at the future of undersea warfare.
Yeah, no, and it's really important to back up and to look at that, because the success that the United States had in breaking Japan's economy during World War II is not something that came about just during the few years of the actual conflict. In fact, the seeds of that success were really planted at the end of World War I. In fact, you had a lot of American submarine officers who, at the end of World War I, brought back to the U.S. A bunch of German boats, U-boats, and pulled them all apart to figure out what made these boats so much superior to the American designs at that point. It was, they were faster to dive, they had better periscope optics, better engines or whatnot. And so the U.S. pulled those things apart and began to dissect them, looking at what worked best, and then use that as sort of a springboard to begin a new American design. And at the same time that they were really looking at a new design, eyes were on the Pacific as a possible flare-up for war against Japan as early as literally 1919. And so if you're really starting to look at where is this war going to be, it's going to be on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean, what kind of technology are you going to need to be able to get there? And remember, the key thing about submarines is they are independent. You've got to build a boat, travel distance, for literally 3 months at a time.
Hang on, James. For some reason, your audio just gone really weird. In a typical World War II TV way, we were chatting for 10 minutes fine, and now suddenly your audio's gone really weird. Do you want to try dropping out and dropping in again? Honestly, folks, I don't know what's happening. I must have, done something in the last few weeks that, I must have walked into a black cat or something, or spilt some salt or something, because I seem to be plagued with gremlins. We were literally chatting for 5 minutes, perfectly fine, and then as soon as we start, it all goes weird again. I don't know why this happens. Yeah, it was fine. It was literally fine when we were chatting, and then something. We'll hope he can bring him back in again. There we are again.
Can you hear me now?
Hear you now. Yep. There we are.
Okay. So where did I leave off? Do you remember where I?
What you were talking about? The plan having been put into place to bringing back German submarines from World War I, and setting out how they could be used, because the spotlight was going to be on the Pacific.
Got it. So basically, yeah, and what I was saying is too is like, you really need to be able to have a submarine that was an independent platform that could be out there for 90 days. It had to be able to carry enough food, fuel, supplies, torpedoes, everything to be able to fight on the opposite side. And so that mission is sort of what became the basis for how they designed what became known as the fleet boat, which was the submarine that the United States had throughout World War II. Now, we would build a couple different classes of them, the Gato and the Vallejo class, but these were inherently very similar boats, just with slight upgrades, hydraulic doors, for example, but they were in general a little bit deeper dive capability, but in general, they were the same type of boat. And so they were, so not only did you have to come up with this whole new technology, you also had to come up with a whole new strategy. And so up until that point, submarines were often viewed as sort of part of the fleet action. So they would go out, they'd be used to either defend the Panama Canal or be part of a carrier task force out there sort of scouting, do things like that. And you had these officers in that interwar period who said, no, the highest and best use of these boats is as independent warfighters. I mean, what other vessel do we have that could sneak into an enemy's harbor and sink ships? So you just need to let these subs go and do what they do best. And so that was, of course, a huge tug of war during that time period. Remember, this is the era of the American battleship Navy, and here you've got these crazy officers trying to say they just want to go off and do their own thing. And so it does create this tug of war. But in the end, the submarine officers are successful on that. And so by the time the war breaks out, you've got an awesome new boat that can travel these vast distances, that can be gone up to 3 months at a time. You've got a whole new strategy to let these boats go out and do what they're going to do best, which is put ships on the bottom of the ocean. And so, boom, literally within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the first American submarines head out for the Pacific, heading all the way to Japan's home waters to begin this mission of destruction. And the map that you've got up there is a perfect example. It shows the vast distances that we're really dealing with in the Pacific. Pacific is 65 million square miles. Of course, Japan controls about 20 million square miles of that. Still a huge piece of real estate, literally 7 time zones. Of course, the United States would lose many of its forward potential bases, Guam, Wake. Of course, the Philippines under siege at the beginning of the war. That's going to fall in April. And so the U.S. literally has to begin its operations taking off from Hawaii and, of course, from Australia. And even from Australia, the distances are vast. And so that's where, again, that technology was so important that you could leave Australia, or leave Hawaii. I mean, just to get one way from Hawaii to Japan's almost 2 weeks. So, you're almost a month in transit in order to have 2 months on station. And so it gives you a sense of the vast distances we're dealing with here. But again, you had the right boat and the right strategy to begin doing that. And Japan, of course, is the perfect adversary for this type of war. For what this map shows you. Okay, it's not a land mass. It's spread across all these sea lanes, all these tiny little islands. They've got troops everywhere from the Dutch East Indies to the Philippines. All their supplies are coming and going. Transports, tankers, everything they need from toothpaste to bullets has to be brought by ship. All of those ships as merchant fleets, they're prime targets for the submarines. And so Japan was just a perfect adversary for this type of war.
And I like the fact that when you're talking about the distances, when we're talking about the big surface battles, we've covered a lot of them on this channel. Half of the story is which side finds out where the other side is going first and which direction they're going to appear from. That seems to be half the interest is in that predictability of it. But with submarines, of course, with it all happening under the water, okay, there are technologies available to detect things, but it's that ability to pop up where you're not being expected, I think, is the key thing that makes it such an asset. But we're also in doing submarine week, we're also talking about economies and factories this week, and we've got to talk about the US's ability to turn out submarines in the numbers they're needed, because as soon as you start to get the Germans and the U-boats, half their problem was just getting enough crews out, getting enough boats out to keep up with the losses. So can you explain a little bit about they've come with the idea of they're going to take the submarine war, but what about producing these new types of submarines, and what was the submarine they produced, and how many were made, and how did that all get set up?
Exactly. And I'll tell you, so when the war begins, America doesn't have a ton of these boats, these new modern fleet boats. We literally have just a few dozen of them. And so it becomes a war of production in a lot of ways because we have to build them. Now, in the end, 288 submarines would fight in the Pacific War. And that's still not a lot of boats. I mean, that really isn't when you think about how many destroyers, destroyer escorts, and things like that the U.S. was putting out there. We were building, and by 1944, we were delivering about 10 new submarines a month to the war. And you got to remember, for every submarine that's on station, it takes 3 boats in the fleet to kind of to make it, because of the amount of time it takes to transit these distances. You periodically have to pull them off for refitting and for repairs and things like that. So, I mean, even though you've got 288, almost 300 at a time, you're really going to have, not even half that many on station at any given time. And of course, the big challenge is figuring out where your enemy's going to be and how. And I think, Paul, you've got one of those maps there that shows sort of the markup of of how the Pacific Ocean, how the Americans sort of carved up the Pacific Ocean there. See, I think there's a grid map on one of those slides.
I'll just get to it. Hang on. I'll find it.
And so what the U.S. did is they said, hey, we don't have that many boats. The Pacific is a really huge space. So what we're going to do is we're going to create grids exactly like this. And these are patrol areas. And each one we're going to give it, a number to. And so when a boat leaves Hawaii or it leaves Australia, they're going to be told, you're going to go to patrol area 14. And any ship, you're going to be the only boat operating in that area. Anything you see in that area is a target. And so each of these patrol areas was sort of overlaid around important shipping lanes, or the Philippines, the Japanese home islands, Korea, places like that, where we knew we were going to find a lot of Japanese merchant vessels. And so you can see there's a lot of open space here where we know that Japanese ships aren't going to be transiting. And so it really helps break down this vast battlefield, so to speak, into manageable chunks that these submarines can then go off and fight in. Now, about midway through the war, we would have a huge technological advance in that we would break the Japanese merchant code, and we would know how exactly they were routing people. And you could say, hey, at noon on April 15th, you're going to be able to find this Japanese convoy is going to be passing at these coordinates. You can go straight there and just shooting fish in a barrel. But up until that point, it literally was what you're looking at here. You're given a patrol area. You go to that area, you patrol, you see what you find, you sink anything that you see there. So it's a really kind of a fascinating way of sort of making the Pacific digestible when you don't have the infinite resources available. Of course, what we've got here is a perfect example, sort of a cutaway of a fleet boat here. It kind of gives the breakdown, showing you everything you had there. Typically, you'd have anywhere between 70 to 80, maybe even up to 88, 89 men serving on board one of these boats. Roughly the length of an American football field. They're just 27 feet wide. You're literally living on top of one another. A lot of hot bunking went on there. Bunks are literally 18 inches apart. You've got a big fridge, a big freezer, but these guys literally learned that the entire boat had to become a pantry. So they took things like, big cans of evaporated milk, loaded them up in a handful of showers that they had, and literally stashed provisions behind the engines. I mean, literally turned the entire boat into a pantry. That's what it took when you were going to be gone out on patrol for up to 90 days.
And just another question for you. We're talking this week about German U-boats, Japanese submarines, the British, everybody. The Americans, are they kind of plowing their own lane with this? I mean, you talked about the fact that they had this sort of doctrine idea in the 1930s. They definitely want to be offensive. That you said that they want to go out there. It's the damage the economy, damage the supply lines. The Japanese, are they kind of plowing their own course this, or are they looking at what the Japanese are doing and the other nations are doing, kind of adapting it? How would you kind of respond to their mindset, if you like?
Yeah, no, this is inherently American strategy for warfighting. This is what we had envisioned in the time period before World War II. It was being put in place. The Japanese had no coherent strategy like we did. In fact, you see that, and again, I keep going back to that period between the wars is so vital because you see technology coalesce around the fleet boat, and you see strategy coalesce around the idea of these independent warfighters. And the Japanese didn't have that. They built everything from little midget submarines all the way up to huge, submarines that could literally carry a float plane on board. And the same thing, not only did they have a whole lot of different, ideas on design, they didn't have a strategy on how to fight them. And they often included submarines as part of larger fleet operations. And that is a weakness because that is not what they are best designed for. In fact, the Germans were frequently saying to the Japanese, you need to look at what the Americans are doing to you. I mean, they're destroying all of your merchant convoys. You need to do the exact same because shipping and logistics are a huge part of the American war in the Pacific. The same distances require, when you're going to go and you're going to invade and land on Iwo Jima, you've got to bring all your supplies, or the Philippines, huge supply lines coming all the way across the ocean, men, fuel, troops, harmonicas, carrier pigeons. I mean, all the things that end up being brought along create these potential targets that the Japanese just totally missed out on. And so later in the war, you do see them begin to kind of come around to that idea. But by then, the momentum is so against Japan at that point that they can't really salvage all their disastrous losses leading up until then. And so that's one thing, too. I'll just add one point. That's such an important thing about this war is like when we look at the war in the Pacific, and of course, it is a war that it has these hallmark moments, these battles. You have Midway, you have Tarawa, you have Iwo Jima. These pivotal moments that are relatively quick. I mean, 4 carriers lost in 24 hours at Midway. I mean, how is that not dramatic? Mm. The submarine war is a battle. It's a war of attrition. It's fought week after week, month after month, year after year. And so it is just a grind that takes place against the Japanese economy. But, for a country like Japan, where it's materially self-sufficient in only 2 industries, fish oil and sulfur, they have to import everything. They're a perfect target for that. And so that by the time you get to the summer of 1944, Japan's economy has been totally decimated. You've got food supplies are literally rotting on docks in Korea because they can't get them over to the mainland. Japan can't get oil in from Dutch East Indies, and so you've got they're going into kamikazes. They're parking their battleships and their naval and their combatants because they don't have the fuel to be able to operate them. And so much of that really is driven by the success of the submarine blockade of the Japanese home islands. And it's just the attention in the Pacific. It just really does.
Well, thanks for that, James. So what I want to ask you next is about the personnel, because when we did the first show yesterday with Angus, people are saying, what would make people want to spend their time in a tube under the water? It's already coming up in a sidebar. People, they wouldn't go on these things for all the tea in China, so to speak. So you've got a doctrine in place. You've got an idea of how the Americans want to use submarines. You've got a submarine that will clearly be up to the job. Who do you find to crew these things? Who do you find to skipper them? Did the Americans set up an entire program? We've talked on this channel about the setting up of navigators and the pilots for the Air Force. How did the submarine service set about finding the individuals, and who are some of the key ones you write about in your book?
Got it. And right now, you're looking at Admiral Charles Lockwood. He is the architect of American submarine war in the Pacific, and he is one of those unsung heroes of World War II. Everybody talks about Bull Halsey and Nimitz and King, and of course, all for great reason, of course. But Lockwood is one of those unsung heroes, and he is the architect of it all. And he is one of the ones that, when they brought those subs back from Germany at the end of World War I, that was involved in pulling them all apart and looking at them. And so he is the ultimate driver of American policy during that. And let me tell you this: he was a champion miler at the Naval Academy. He ran a mile in like 4 minutes, 22 seconds. I mean, he's a crazy fast guy. Yeah. He brought this like endurance philosophy to warfighting, which is, the war against the Japanese is not going to be a sprint. It is going to be a marathon. And so you've got to have that mindset. And so he really is, they called him Uncle Charlie. I mean, he's really tight with his boys. The submarine service is very, very small. Only 16,000 sailors are going to serve in it throughout the totality of the war. He gets really, really close with these guys. He's sort of the pinnacle, so to speak, of leadership. Now, I'm not sure if you've got a photo there of Mush Morton. I think there's maybe one of him catching a football.
Yep, I'll get to that. Hang on. Yep,
I'll find it. The challenge, of course, is kind of like with the air war, is that when you begin this new you begin World War II and you begin fighting with submarines in this way, you don't have the established doctrine and ideas. There's Mush Morton there. I love that photograph of him. I mean, he's without a doubt probably one of the most transformative figures in the undersea war. And so you've got all these skippers who during peacetime are trained during peacetime. They suddenly begin the war. They don't really know, hey, how is the visibility? Can people see my sub? How close can I get to the enemy convoys? Things like that. They're trying to kind of have to figure this out as they go forward. And so you invariably run into the fact that you've got some of these skippers that just really, quite frankly, aren't cut out for it. And then onto this stage comes Mush Morton. And you see him pictured here. And he is a Naval Academy guy, incredible athlete. You see him here catching a football. He's really a wrestler. And so his forte was in wrestling. And he brings that same philosophy in wrestling to submarine fighting, which is if you're going to win, you've got to get up close to your enemy and you've got to grapple with them, you know? And he takes that idea to fighting submarines, which is you can't shoot a torpedo from 3,000 yards out, 2,000 yards out and hope to have any success. You got to get right up on them and you got to hit them. You got to hit them again and again and again until you put them on the bottom. And he applies that not only just against single targets, but against convoys. He's the first skipper credited, in fact, with sinking an entire Japanese convoy. Post-war records would show I think one of the 4 actually survived, but fact remains, he kind of came up with the idea about really going after destroying them all and doing that. And then also one of my favorite anecdotes about Mush Morton is he could put like 5 golf balls in his mouth at one time. I mean, let's be honest. Just, A, who thinks of doing that? And B, but he's just a really amazing, colorful character, and he really shows what the potential can be for submarine warfare. And he has this protege, a guy by the name of Dick O'Kane. And Dick O'Kane will go on actually to become one of the war's great skippers. He will be skipper of the Tang. Mush Morton and Dick were actually officer and XO on board the Wahoo. O'Kane will go on, he'll take over the Tang, and he will have the best record of World War II. He'll sink like 22 ships in the span of like 9 months, which is just an incredible record. Literally a ship sunk for every 10 days he was on patrol. But these 2 individuals really showed how submarines could be fought effectively and decimate the Japanese. And so they become sort of these leaders in the undersea service at that point.
Well, brilliant. Thanks for that. And I want to carry on now a little bit about the people again and just the life on board, because, there's long missions, long patrols, lots of time away. But if you don't get the results at the end of all these long missions, it's all been for nothing. And one of the things, the metrics we find very difficult on this channel is measuring the success, because you've written about the Doolittle raid. There is something that's very, very hard to kind of measure what it achieved. But with submarines, you gotta sink stuff. If you're not sinking stuff, it's not working. So, what was the arc of the US submarine sort of actions in World War II? Was it a steady increase? Did it suffer from problems at the beginning? It get better? I mean, with strategic bombing certainly had its ups and downs. How did it go for the submarine aspect? Was it a sort of steady getting better and better?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it is very comparable to strategic bombing in a lot of ways, because just like with strategic bombing, you have technological issues at the beginning of it. I mean, think of the B-29, which we've talked about in the past and struggles there. Think of the American torpedo, which is a huge issue at the beginning of the war that really takes months, about 18 months or so to sort out. And so you've got these skippers going out there with a faulty weapon. Okay, the torpedo is a very complex weapon. They literally cost I think back in the day, they cost about $10,000 a piece. It's literally the equivalent of 4 ensign salaries to build, and they're basically function as small submarines. And they had a huge challenge in that they were running way too deep. And so instead of going right underneath the ship and detonating or impacting on the side of the ship, they were running 40, 50, 60 feet under. And so you had a lot of skippers who went out, lined up great shots, pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. And so when the skippers were complaining about the torpedoes, the Bureau of Ordnance, which sort of managed all of it, said, it's not our weapon. It's you guys are bad shots. And so it took Lockwood to be one of the first ones to say, you know what, I'm going to trust my guys here, and I'm going to get a bunch of fishing nets down in Australia, and we're going to run some tests, and we're going to figure out, what is going on. And it's through his faith in his men and through those tests, they discover that it was in fact a faulty weapon. By the time they sort of jury rig it in such a way that they can make it serviceable, they've lost these valuable early time period in the war, because Japan is now using more and more escorts. They're being a lot more careful about the American submarines at that point. But early in the war, that metric is based on how many ships you sink. And if a skipper went out and had a bad patrol, didn't sink anything, and came back, I think they gave you typically 1 or 2 patrols like that, and then you'd wash out. You would go on to desk duty, and they would send somebody else out. They would deem that you were not aggressive enough. Now, early in the war, of course, there are lots and lots of targets out there. Japan is They're moving everything by water at this point. Japan never has the capability to build back after they start suffering tremendous losses. So by 44, and particularly in the early 45, the seas are empty. So a lot of these young submarine skippers heading out in late 44, early 45 are finding that there's literally just fishing trawlers and sampans that are left. And so it becomes a really hard metric for them to sort of gauge that success. So you have these guys early in the war going out, getting multiple Navy crosses, sinking lots of Japanese ships. But as the Japanese, fleet decreases, they're not building back. The targets become more and more scarce and a lot harder on that. So, but at the end of the day, the metric is ships on the bottom, putting targets on the bottom of the day.
Okay, thanks. So in looking at that map again there, because one of the things we talked about with Angus yesterday is how the British developed these techniques against the U-boat. So, you said there, some of these innovators, it's about bringing their subs in right up close to the enemy, but the enemy are also using more escorts, things like that. I'm also thinking, as the war progresses, you're getting closer and closer to Japan. And by that point, the risks, because you're further away from home, you're further away from the bases. Did the Japanese develop any particular anti-submarine tactics beyond just putting lots of escorts around their convoys? Did they ever, go the same way the British and Americans did to kind of really combat what the American submarines were doing?
Not like they should have, no. And the Japanese were, they used sonar, of course. They used airplanes as well for spotting, but just similar to sort of how Japan kind of looked down on radar initially and felt that eyesight was superior. They applied that same thing with submarines, and they had a lot of their ships, a lot of their escorts, they really fell back on using the eyesight of lookouts. And so what I found so fascinating too is like so much of how these American submariners fought was they fought at night. And so they would literally, in the morning you would be out on, you would come up to the surface, you're scanning the horizon, you would see this little puff of smoke in the far horizon. You'd spend that entire day just chasing after it. So you figured out what you had, you kept your distance, and then you waited until nightfall, and then you waited until after the moon set. There was no light out there, and then you attacked at 4 o'clock in the morning. So these attacks would go on in some cases for 24 hours, and then in some cases they could go on even longer, up to 48 hours, because once the convoy scatters, you start hunting all over again. And so you're catching cat naps here and there. You're smoking a lot of cigarettes. You're drinking a ton of coffee. And you're hunting. And so, but that's where the Japanese, their failure to use radar, their failure to use, they're relying so much on lookouts was just, really, really terrible idea. I mean, one of my favorite stories is Dick O'Kane, who's skipper of the Tang. I mean, he really takes advantage of that and manages to penetrate this huge Japanese convoy. Literally, this convoy is so big that it has 2 defensive perimeters of escorts. So in the middle of the night, he takes advantage of the fact that lookouts aren't going to be able to see very well, and that if he moves at a certain pace, that he keeps literally the same exact pace, almost just a tad bit faster than the ships he's passing, he won't trigger the peripheral vision of the lookouts. And so he's able to just literally penetrate all the way inside of this convoy, these defensive lines, and just sink several of their ships. And so it's really just ingenious. A maneuver by O'Kane on that.
Brilliant stuff, James. We'll do a couple of questions because they've been coming in steadily. So you talked about the US submarine being of its time comparatively large. So Ian Carr is saying the US fleet boats were large subs for their day. Did the US look at smaller subs for shallow seas and other means of refueling? Because we're going to be talking about the British midget subs. They were used with success in various theaters. Did the Americans go for anything beyond kind of the particular size boats we talked about earlier?
No, they didn't. No, in fact, they were the only other boats they had were the hangovers from World War I, the old S boats, and they were just phasing those out because they couldn't cover the distances. So all the boats that they used and that they hammered out during World War II were of the fleet boat, the Gato Valero class.
Okay,
we talked about.
Thanks. Another one, Jeff Brayton is asking, how useful was magic?
Yeah, very much so. And that's what I was talking about earlier, when they broke the Japanese merchant code. And once they did that, I mean, it was shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, you know exactly. And the one great thing about the Japanese is when they say this convoy is going to be here at this time on this date, they're there. So, I mean, it really you could direct submarines straight to where a convoy was going to be and just set them up for the shot. So really, really successful in helping to, by 1943, really pushing submarine warfare to its maximum destruction.
Brilliant, thank you. And this is another one, I think there's possibly a spelling mistake. Peter O'Connor is saying, did the Mark 14 torpedo failure issue somehow, I think that's lull the Japanese into discounting the US sub threat and lead to their failing to adequately protect their shipping? I mean, and a greater question would be, were the Japanese aware that the Americans are having problems with their torpedoes? I think it's probably another way of phrasing that.
Yeah, no, they were not aware of the problems. At least nothing I've ever read indicates that they were aware of the problems that we were having. But there's no doubt they were encountering American subs and not having the success early in the war, early 1942, summer of 1942 and fall, that they would have later on. And so it's quite possible that they just didn't think the threat was as big as it was early on. That, of course, changes by 43, 44 as the submarines just really begin to ravage the Japanese merchant fleet.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to put up these photos now of just life on board these submarines, and in your book, you focus on the 3 particular submarines, but, you've written about people in the air, you've written about people on the ground, Manila, you've written about the submariners. Everyone I've spoken to who studied them, or those who were a submariner in any era, you talked about, they are kind of a breed apart, aren't they? And, is it different researching that breed of men? Or is that kind of a cliche that they're breed apart? What's your assessment of the typical American submariner?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say, one of the things is this was a volunteer service. So you didn't get assigned to it. You had to volunteer for it. Now, it did come with extra pay. And I think a really formative thing that played a role with all these guys was that so many of them had come through the Great Depression. And so they come through this just incredibly austere childhoods. They had been growing up in poverty. They'd grown up suffering and for want for a lot of things. And one of the things that really appealed to a lot of these guys is that on a submarine, you could eat anytime you wanted. They had an open icebox policy. So if you were hungry, you could go down there. You could cooks would whip you up a sandwich, or you could make one. Even though a lot of the food was canned and things like that, they said that they had really some of the best food in the Navy that you had there. And so I think, those kinds of factors. And look, if you're 18, 19, 20 years old, I mean, look, I've got 2 teenagers. I mean, I know how much they eat. The idea that you can eat anytime you want is awesome at that age. But it did really require some creativity. I mean, for example, they said, well, we can't take soft drinks with us, no Coca-Cola, because, there's no space to bring it. So they realized that you could take Coca-Cola syrup and CO2 cartridges, and you could carbonate it yourself and make your own drinks. It also presented other challenges. One of my favorites was one of the cooks told me, he said, invariably when you've been out at sea for a while, you begin to get weevils in your flour and things like that. And he said, what I learned to do is I just threw in a bunch of caraway seeds and baked fried bread. None of the guys ever knew I was cooking bugs in their breads like that. So it does, it's a little bit of a different breed apart. There's a lot of informality on board submarines. The guys wore flip-flops, they wore shorts. There was more of the division between the officers and enlisted men sort of erodes a bit. It's small. I mean, these are small units. You're 70, 80 men on board. You get to know everybody really, really well. For officers, it's a great opportunity to progress very quickly. If you're a young junior officer on board an aircraft carrier or battleship and you're going to the wardroom, you're one of dozens and dozens of ensigns and lieutenant JGs. You're on a submarine. I mean, you had guys at age 26. Mike Rinskoff becomes the youngest skipper of a fleet boat in World War II. He's 26 years old. Meanwhile, his Naval Academy graduates, classmates, they're still, very middle of the ranks on surface ships. And so it was a great opportunity for that advancement quickly as well. A lot of responsibility, a lot of potential advancement.
Brilliant response. So my next question is about where we are in understand, because I'm a great movie buff, and back in the 1950s, Hollywood was churning out submarine movies like 2 a year: Torpedo, Run Silent, Run Deep. Everyone was in them. Clark Gable, Glenn Ford, Ernest Borgnine, everyone was in one of those movies. And yet it seems to me as a historian that it was a surface battles. It was the big carrier versus carrier and battleship battles that kind of drove the writing of history for decades after war. And yet, I'll ask you to explain some of the bare statistics, because the American submarine absolutely had a massive impact on winning the war. So, what were the material gains that the American submarines had over the Japanese, and B, why weren't historians talking about it for a long time in that kind of 60s, 70s, 80s period?
Yeah. I'll tell you one thing. In submarine warfare is inherently repetitive.
Right.
You go out, you take your 24 torpedoes, you fire them all, you come back, you load up, you go out again. And so even some of your classic submarine movies like Run Silent, Run Deep has a twist to it. And it's that, why are these boats all getting lost? What did the Japanese figure out here to get around it? But if you make a movie that is just about going out, sinking stuff, coming back, going back out, sinking stuff, coming back, it gets a little bit repetitive. And I ran into that in writing the book. And so, in fact, in choosing the different submarines that I wrote about, I picked certain ones that had unique anecdotes and things like that. That the book had that diversity of story, appendectomies and hell ship sinkings and things of that nature to kind of get around it. I think that's partly what explains some of it. And then I'm sorry, but the last question you had was about the. Paul, remind me.
Oh God, what effect did it have, and what tonnage did it ship? What effect did it have on the Japanese sinews of war?
Yeah, and it's great. You got to remember, Japan starts the war on borrowed time, right? They're a materially bankrupt nation. They're having to import everything that they have, even including rice, and so and of course all their fuel oil and everything like that they need they've stockpiled it and everything. So they're never replenishing. So soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they begin eating into those reserves. And so their hopes that this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would sort of fill their coffers with everything they needed proved completely unfounded, because the submarines get in there and start sinking everything. And so they're constantly running into loss of materials. That's everything from food to fuel, to the bauxite they need to make aluminum, the rubber they need for tires, the cotton they need for uniforms. And so it's just constantly eroding the efficiency of their war machine, to the point that by the time the first B-29 start taking off in 1944, November 1944, the Japanese economy has begun what becomes its death spiral. And you really see that by 1945. The average caloric intake of the Japanese has dropped down to about 1,600 calories. The average person spending somewhere around 5 hours a day trying to figure out where their next meal's coming from. And of course, you see it on the battlefield as well. You got battleships that are relegated to anti-aircraft duty because they don't have the fuel. You got kamikazes taken off. So you really see that the effect it has on breaking the back of the Japanese economy. Now, the challenge for the Japanese leadership and Japanese people is, how do you visualize hunger and those kinds of challenges that the submarine war has inflicted upon Japan? And that is where I do think that the B-29 campaign comes in and helps make it clear that defeat is imminent through the burning of the cities and the destroying of factories and all of that. It's sort of that 1-2 punch between the submarine war and the B-29 campaign.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because we talked about that before going online. In that, as Indy Nidell says on his channel, nothing happens in a vacuum. And as someone like yourself who has now looked at the aerial war, the ground war, the sea war, you realize that whenever we talk about it being one thing that won the war, it's never one thing that won the war. It's all of the things combining, and therefore for the enemy, it's all the things combining. It's not one thing that the Japanese were falling victim to anymore. It was one thing that's winning it. So it's that combined approach, that understanding that it was the air, the sea, the land that was causing that collapse of the Japanese empire. Which it's interesting that in the ETO and then the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans had these distinct happy times where, even though the Allies were kind of gaining an upper hand globally, they were still managing to kind of pull something out the bag. Yet it seems the Japanese, pretty much after Pearl Harbor, it's kind of cataclysmic downward turn and just gets worse and worse for them. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, I think you look at the success they have early in the war is, quite frankly, it's Guam, it's Wake, it's the Philippines. Even the Philippines, they're super, super slow to get. They were expecting to have the Philippines under control by the end of January. It's not until April. Bataan Falls, May, Corregidor. Then, of course, by that point, you've got the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway coming up, which ends badly for the Japanese, and the Guadalcanal just grinds them down, and ships and pilots. And so it really, at that point, they never are able to get back into sort of seizing that initiative and be victorious.
Brilliant. Well, we've got a couple of questions again coming in because people are loving your expertise, so we'll deal with them now. So David Levine is saying, did the US sub force have many successes sinking warships? We talked about the merchants logistics, but did it, were there any notable sinking of important combat vessels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they sunk a bunch of aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers. I don't have the exact tally on the top of my head, but if you go and look at my book, it's in there in the epilogue because they did. Even though the subs were after the merchant fleet, which is the lifeblood of the Japanese military, they never pass up an opportunity to go after the Japanese naval combatants. And of course, a big target for them was the tankers. You're moving this fuel, which is vital to the Japanese empire. So whenever they saw tankers, they really went after them big time.
Okay, I love the fact that doing it live, you get these questions I would never think of asking, and it's a great one from Rob Crane. What was the Japanese attitude if they came across survivors who'd escaped from a sunk sub? Would they pick them up?
Yeah, yes and no. Submariners and B-29 pilots and crews suffered some of the worst at the hands of the Japanese. And so, in fact, they had these unregistered prisoner of war camps like Afuna back in the Japanese mainland, which basically were torture centers. They brought these guys back. They were very much trying to figure out the ins and outs of the submarine campaign and, of course, the B-29 campaign. And so, they captured prisoners of war are a great intel source. And so the Tang, for example, gets hit by its own sort of malfunctioning torpedo, and 9 of those guys end up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp where they are literally just beaten, tortured, everything, and finally transferred to a registered prisoner of war camp. Same thing happened with the B-29 guys. These were who the Japanese were after, and they showed their fury for the destruction of their cities and the destruction of their merchant fleet in the tactics they used against these prisoners.
Thank you. And then another one from Scott Grimwood. Can James talk about the use of FM sonar to break into the Sea of Japan in 1945?
Yeah, probably could have talked a little bit better about that 15 years ago when I was working on it, but I hate to say it, I'm a little bit rusty on some of the details like that now, so I'll beg off on that one.
Okay, no worries. So we'll just carry on talking about some of the people, I think, because as you said there, to write the book, you had to find characters, you had to find anecdotes. So we'll just pull up a few other slides you sent me and just kind of talk about some of the people. So over to you.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite characters. This is a guy by the name of John Vienna, and he served almost the entire war as an officer on board the USS Silversides. And and when I was beginning my research for this book back in 08, 09 or so, there were a lot of these submarine guys were still around. So they were having reunions and things like that. So I was able to go to reunions. I was able to connect with veterans. But for Vienna had actually passed away back, I want to say back in like the 1970s. And so I was looking at crew rosters and saw how long he had served. So I really wanted to have an opportunity to kind of find out if he'd left any papers behind. So I managed through an obituary to track down his son of Hawaii. And I called his son up and I said, I know your dad's been dead now for almost 4 decades at that point. I said, but is there any chance he left behind any diary, any letters, things like that? And his son told me, he said, my mom died last year, and right before she died, she came to me with a box of all of my father's wartime letters. And she said, whatever you do, hang on to these. Someday somebody's going to want them. And about a month later, over 300 pages of his letters, photocopies of them, showed up at my doorstep. And these were a gold mine. I mean, he'd served almost the whole war on this boat. And one of my favorite details he wrote is that he'd been on that boat so long. You got to remember, there's no big screen TVs, there's no Netflix, there's nothing. You're listening to gramophone records and you're playing AC/DC and poker. He'd been on that boat so long that the needle on a gramophone could play 1,000 records. He went through 5 needles on his gramophone. So, I mean, imagine 5,000 records being played on that boat. And so he had all these other wonderful details, that at the time they found 2 mice on board the Silversides, which had come on board, I'm sure with a bunch of the supplies they brought on. And of course, the crew named these 2 mice Romeo and Juliet, and then they accidentally shot Juliet out of the torpedo tube. And, they just had these great moments of color, the kind of details you're never going to find in a patrol report or a deck log or anything like that, that really just provided this window into what it was like for these young men who served. What we got here actually are two guys here that we've got the pharmacist mate and his patient from one of the first appendectomies ever performed on board the USS Silversides. They were out off of the coast of Rabaul. One of the guys comes down, George Platter comes down, just George Platter on the right there. He comes down with a case of appendicitis. The skipper, Creed Burlingame, says there's no way we're going back for one kid with appendicitis. And so he tells the pharmacist mate, you got to remember, an American pharmacist mate during World War II had about 12 weeks of training. Because, surely you can take that guy's appendix out. So they set up in the wardroom of the Silversides. And this operation normally would take about half an hour. Tom Moore has, struggling his way through it, very, very cautious. It takes over 4 hours.
Wow.
So he wakes up during the middle of the procedure. He ends up having to give him more anesthesia, ends up getting pulled into the air system on the submarine. People are getting woozy all on board. But he's finally able to remove the appendix and suture him back up. And both men lived all the way up until their 80s. And so it was great, actually. The Silversides is a museum ship in Muskegon, Michigan. And so when I was researching the book, I went up there, sat in that wardroom, took measurements of the table to kind of figure out how big it was. Because, of course, it's not big enough for a man to lie on. So they use an ironing board to be able to prop up his legs. And then, fortunately, one of the officers on the ship was an amateur photographer. So he captured some of the only photographs during World War II of an operation like this done, 150 feet underwater off the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. And I think you've got a couple of those pictures in that slide deck.
Yeah, I've got them somewhere.
They kind of show what this procedure was like. Yeah, you can see a close-up shot there. Robert Worthington was the officer, and he shot and developed these images on board the Silversides. You can see it's super hot on there. That's why they all stripped their shirts off, and because they were there in the enemy waters. Didn't want to keep the noise level at a minimum. Shut down the AC system, park at about 150 feet, and start your surgery there. So if you back up that one slide, Creed Burlingame right there with the corncob pipe. I mean, he's a total swat. He was the skipper of the Silversides at that time, and really one of America's top submarine skippers as well. And just a really, really colorful personality. And your next slide you just showed actually was Creed Burlingame and Jack Coy. And of course, Burlingame there, a little more clean shaven on the right, still has his corncob pipe in his hand. He is there with Jack Coy, who will replace him. And these two guys will help make the Silversides one of the top submarines of World War II. So really just both of them, very different personalities. Burlingame was this sort of swashbuckler pirate, represented sort of the early era of the war when those kind of tactics and aggression were really needed. Jack Coy, his successor, another Naval Academy graduate, far more scientific, far more analytical, really represented the type of warfighter you needed in the second part of the war when you were relying more and more on technology and on strategy and on sort of outthinking the Japanese. So really just one of those boats that benefited from tremendous leadership. And that's Jack Coy, again, with his 9/11, so 1911, so doing a little target practicing. So
brilliant, and they're brilliant photos, and the fact you have so many of them as well that you sent, and all the contact sheets, and the fact they're referred. I mean, it's rife for historians to study. People were saying in the sidebar how much is now online of the Navy logs, the ship's logs, things like that. So it's something that can still be studied. But another photo there, Tokyo. So what's the story behind that one?
Let me show you here. Take a look. So the guy on the back row, second over from the left, that's Mike Renskoff. Okay, and you can see how young he is, right? He is the one who at age 26 becomes the youngest submarine skipper of World War II. He's given command of the USS Drum, which is a submarine ship. It's a museum ship in Mobile, Alabama. You can go visit it today. In fact, I spent a week there on board doing research when I was working on this book. Did you get a sense of just how young Mike was there? He started off as the mess officer on the Drum and worked his way all the way up to becoming the skipper in the span of just a few years. So pretty incredible story there. And what they've got there, of course, is one of the ring buoys from one of the ships they sunk. Submariners they would love debris fields. After they sunk a ship, they always would go out into the debris field, see what you could rescue, bottles of sake, things like that. I mean, I've actually got here on my desk. If I can find it, where is it? Where's it buried in my knick-knack drawer here? I actually have a piece of a Japanese ship that one of the officers gave me. Here it is. Oh, I just got the wrong one. This is actually from the piece of debris from a ship sunk by the Silversides.
Wow.
One of the guys salvaged it, and this is from the Kazan Maru. So it's a little keepsake that I've got from that. So,
incredible.
Yeah.
So we're kind of sliding towards the end of this show now because it's meant to be an introduction, but we'll tackle this a bit later on. I want to get back to this idea of where we are in historiography because you said yourself this is one of your earlier books. It was just James Scott then without the M. You've adapted your name since then, but in terms of understanding where we are, the submarine war, is there more work to be done on this?
Yeah, let me say. So I was James Scott up until some guy named James Scott started writing novels, and I probably made me put my middle initial on there so that we wouldn't be confused. And so, totally random story, but the two of us actually follow each other on Twitter, and it kind of goes back and forth. But anyway, so that's a secret window into the publishing world, right? So, there's definitely more to be done. I think more and more records coming out of more and more can be done looking at Japan, the effect on its economy. You're seeing lots more books coming out. In fact, I just did a dust jacket board for one recently. Smaller story of what one boat went through, what one crew went through, and then of course more and more records coming out of the magic files and things like that. That'll help us, I think, sort of get a bigger picture of just how effective some of the intercepts were and things like that. So here you got Mush Morton and Dick O'Kane. Mush Morton is on the right. Remember, look at that jaw. As Time Magazine said, he had a jaw like a boulder. That's the mouth that can put 5 golf balls in it. And of course, that's Dick O'Kane, his protege. Now, Mush Morton, incidentally, would be a victim of the Japanese. He was lost in 1944 on board the Wahoo. There in Japanese waters because he couldn't get deep enough. He was in shallow waters and he couldn't get under 200 feet of water, couldn't go deep, couldn't get away, and the Japanese got him. And in fact, it's his loss that motivates Dick O'Kane in so many ways to go on and do what he does as the skipper of the Tang. But the two of them really were just they're like the fulcrum, I think, in a lot of ways. Submarine war, really, the balance shifts and it comes down to the backs of these two individuals. And Mush Morton, fascinatingly enough, his personal papers are on file in Hawaii, which of course out at the Bowfin Museum and Archive out there. Includes all his personal letters and things like that, which are just for historians, a real gold mine to get to go and read through and see the inner thinkings of this guy that becomes such a pioneer in submarine warfare.
Okay, thank you. Another couple of questions. So first one from Rick Green. Can James speak about the role of subs in reconnaissance for amphibious landings? That was something they're involved in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And subs play a big role in that. In fact, they go out, they photograph the beaches, the landing beaches in advance, they do weather readings. They do a lot of stuff to kind of help with the invasions. And so that's an important role. Another big role they play in addition to that is picking up down flyers. People don't realize, but submarines can get right in and close. If you're doing like airstrikes on truck, for example, the Tang rescued 22 flyers during those airstrikes. And so they played a lot of different roles. Later in the war, too, as the Japanese targets got fewer and fewer, they teamed up and fought as wolf packs, just like their name implies, fighting in groups. And so they could go out and sort of maximize their efficiency that way. So yeah, they played a lot of different roles.
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether you'll know this one. Trent Tolenko is our radar expert. He says 7th Fleet subs did a lot of radar hunting, plotting for MacArthur's Section 22 radar hunters. How much did subs of the Central Pacific do that role for Nimitz?
Sorry, I had a distraction in the background. That I'm not sure about what kind of role they played in the Central Pacific for that. A lot of the stuff going on during the Central Pacific was when a lot of the subs were really doing a lot of their independent fighting and stuff like that. That's in 1943, which is really kind of the heyday of submarines out there sinking there. It's not really until later in 44 and really into 45 when you start seeing subs getting pulled more and more into doing assignments. They really resisted. A lot of the submarines guys resisted getting pulled off to have to do these other types of operations, because at the end of the day, they're judged on how many ships you sink. And if you're going out and reconning a beach and things like that, you're not sinking ships. And so even though those were valuable roles, a lot of the guys resisted them.
Okay, thank you. And I think you kind of touched on this one really, but Peter O'Connell, at what point did US Submarine Command realize they'd run out of targets? Because you get to that point towards the middle of 45 when the war is not quite won, but you talked about the rescuing of pilots, the wolf packs. I mean, was the war a bit of the end of the war a bit kind of an anticlimax in some ways for some of these legendary crews?
Yeah, no, it really is. And by that point, too, a lot of these guys, at that point, Dick O'Kane was actually in a prisoner of war camp. Rush Morton was gone. Jack Coy was gone. Creed Burlingame was gone. A lot of them had sort of moved up to become division officers and higher ranks and stuff like that. And so they were sort of cycling these guys through. But by late 44, early 45, they're out of targets. They're shooting at sampans. They're shooting at fishing boats. Poor Mike Renskoff, that young fleet boat skipper from the Drum, comes in and he's just, he's frustrated. They go out and they sink a sampan, they capture a couple of Japanese prisoners of war. And to them, that's a big success when literally 2.5 years earlier, you could sink a whole convoy. So it really, it definitely drops off.
Okay, thanks. And another one here, Stuart Bertie is asked, hi Stuart, would the US crews ever offer assistance after sinking merchant ships? So they've sunk a Japanese ship. What does the procedure then go in terms of trying to pick up survivors?
They periodically would capture a survivor or two that they could use for intel and stuff like that. But in general, they had no capacity to bring anybody back, and so the submarines are tight enough as is. You sink a huge transport, you got 200 guys in the water. Where are you going to put them? So they might throw out some rafts or ring buoys and things like that. But a lot of times too, Japanese, it's important to remember, they had Japanese escorts around. And so it only in the fluke case where you ran across a stray ship or you sank all of them in a convoy, did the Japanese not have some sort of surface assistance there to help them. And frequently it fell to the destroyer escorts or the destroyers to be the ones that have to go in and pick up the Japanese that were in the water.
Okay, thanks. And my last question, we'll round things off, is for the World War II TV audience who study everything, they read about the Eastern Front and Western Front and air, sea, and land, and what would be a kind of a takeaway you would want people to kind of leave here with an idea about the US submarine effort that perhaps they hadn't thought about? Is there something you'd like to sum it up in a particular way?
Yeah, I mean, it is the submarines that break the back of the Japanese economy, and it's not glamorous like the Battle of Midway. Or the atomic bombing. I mean, it is this war that is fought week after week, month after month, year after year. But in the end, its effects are seen everywhere in the streets of Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, in the homes of the Japanese residents as they're struggling to eat and struggling to survive. I mean, it is the submarine war that does that. And so that it's not glamorous. I mean, it's not, you don't see some big Roland Emmerich film being made about the submarine service like he did Midway a few years ago, but it has a huge effect on the outcome. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways.
I think that's where we'll leave it, and that's what my takeaway is and not just American submarines. We get on with this week. We talk about the British ops in the Indian Ocean next week with Ian Ballantyne. It's that chipping away. It's unglamorous, long patrols. But that one merchant they sink on that one patrol makes a huge difference. I think when we talked about it earlier, it's measuring the effectiveness is so hard. Sometimes 80 years on, we look at again some of the airborne operations. Were they effective? Did they achieve what they were supposed to? But tonnage was lost. This, as you said there, it absolutely reduced the Japanese ability to wage war, and I think that's the important takeaway.
Absolutely.
Well, we will leave it there, James. So, folks, we're back in with the economies tomorrow. Mark R. Wilson is talking about American factories tomorrow, so we may end up mentoring submarines, and we've got more stuff coming up the next few days and weeks. Thank you, James. I'll look forward to inviting you back for something else in the future. But in the meantime, thanks, everybody, for great questions. Thank you, James, and thank you for watching. And I will see you all again. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.